What happens when rock's most brutally honest voice turns its fury on the very industry that made him famous? John Lennon didn't just write songs that changed the world. He waged war against the corporate machine that tried to control him. While millions knew him as the peaceful dreamer behind Imagine, behind closed doors, Lennon was fighting battles that would expose the music industry's darkest secrets. The story begins in the early 1960s, when four young men from Liverpool signed contracts they barely understood. What they didn't realize was that they were entering a system designed to extract maximum profit from their talent, while leaving them with minimal control over their own creations. The music industry operated like a feudal system. Artists were serfs, and the labels and publishers were the lords who owned everything of value. Most musicians who discovered these harsh realities kept quiet, afraid that speaking out would destroy their careers. But John Lennon was different. He possessed a burning need for truth that made diplomatic silence impossible, even when the financial cost was enormous. His journey from naive young artist to battle-hardened industry critic would expose corruption that reached into every corner of the music business, from the publishing companies to record labels to management firms. The transformation wasn't instant. It took years of systematic betrayal before Lennon fully understood how the game was rigged against artists. Each broken promise and manipulated contract taught him that success in music didn't protect you from exploitation. It made you a more valuable target. The bigger the Beatles became, the more predators circled, looking for ways to profit from their creativity while giving back as little as possible. What made Lennon's situation particularly devastating was the personal nature of the betrayals. These weren't anonymous corporate executives hiding behind legal departments. These were trusted friends, father figures, and business partners who smiled warmly while systematically stripping away his rights. The music industry's exploitation wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal, turning every handshake into a potential trap and every contract into a weapon aimed at the artist's future. John Lennon's awakening to this reality was brutal. Each betrayal, each contract dispute taught him harsh lessons about how the business really worked. Behind the peace signs and philosophical lyrics was a man who learned that success doesn't protect you from exploitation. It makes you a bigger target. The more valuable your music becomes, the more people want to control it and profit from it. These are the moments when John Lennon dropped his diplomatic mask and revealed exactly what he thought about the system that both created and nearly destroyed him. From devastating publishing betrayals to systematic record label exploitation, this is the story of how rock's most outspoken rebel took on the music industry and refused to back down. The story of John Lennon's war with the music industry begins with what he would later call the greatest betrayal of his career. In 1963, when the Beatles were still hungry unknowns desperate for any kind of recording deal, they signed a publishing agreement that would haunt them for decades. Dick James, their music publisher, seemed like a godsend. A respected industry veteran who believed in their talent when major labels were still dismissing them as just another flash-in-the-pan boy band. He presented himself as a father figure, offering guidance to four young musicians who knew absolutely nothing about the business side of music. What the Beatles didn't understand was the fundamental difference between making records and owning the rights to songs. While they focused on creating music that would change popular culture forever, Dick James was quietly constructing a legal framework that would ensure he profited from their creativity for the rest of their lives. The publishing industry in the 1960s operated on a system specifically designed to exploit young artists who didn't understand the long-term value of their work. Publishers would offer small upfront payments and promises of promotion in exchange for ownership of songs that could generate massive income for decades. The deal itself was staggeringly unfair from the moment it was signed, though the Beatles were too inexperienced to recognize the trap they were walking into. Lennon and McCartney, the songwriters who would create some of the most valuable intellectual property in entertainment history, received just 20% each of their publishing rights. Dick James kept a massive 50% for himself, with the remaining 10% going to their manager, Brian Epstein. This meant that for legendary songs like Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be, the men who actually wrote the words and music were minority shareholders in their own artistic creations. The personal dimension of this betrayal made it cut even deeper than a simple business transaction gone wrong. Dick James wasn't just a publisher to the Beatles. He became a trusted family friend who was invited to personal celebrations, holiday gatherings, and intimate band meetings. He positioned himself as a protective figure who understood the music business and would shield them from the sharks and con artists who preyed on successful musicians. This personal relationship made his eventual betrayal feel like a knife in the back from someone they considered family. The publishing industry's exploitation went beyond just taking ownership of songs. It involved a systematic deception about how much money these rights were actually worth. James convinced the Beatles that publishing was a minor revenue stream compared to record sales and live performances, when in reality it represented the most valuable long-term asset they would ever create. Every time a Beatles song played on the radio, appeared in a movie, or was covered by another artist, James was collecting the majority of the royalties, while the actual songwriters received a fraction of what their work generated. But the ultimate betrayal came in 1969, at the height of the Beatles' creative and commercial success, when Dick James made a decision that would define Lennon's relationship with the music industry forever. Without any warning to Lennon or McCartney, James sold Northern songs to ATV Music for millions of pounds, effectively auctioning off the Beatles' entire songwriting catalog to the highest bidder. The songwriters discovered they'd lost control of their life's work by reading about it in the morning newspaper, learning that someone else now owned the rights to every song they'd ever written. The sale wasn't just a business transaction, it was a deliberate act of betrayal that showed James had never viewed the Beatles as partners, only as assets to be monetized and eventually sold when the price was right. In 1968, flush with success but frustrated by corporate constraints, the Beatles launched their own company, Apple Corps. It wasn't just a record label. It was supposed to be a revolution. The four lads from Liverpool, now global superstars, believed they could create something unprecedented, a company that would nurture artists instead of exploiting them, that would prioritize creativity over commerce, that would prove the music industry could operate on principles of fairness and artistic integrity. The vision was intoxicating. Apple Corps would be a multimedia empire encompassing records, films, publishing, and electronics, all run by artists for artists. Lennon and his bandmates envisioned signing unknown talents and giving them complete creative freedom, something they themselves had rarely enjoyed under traditional record company contracts. They would bypass the corporate gatekeepers who had controlled their careers, the executives who treated musicians like performing monkeys, the accountants who saw artistic expression as just another line item on a balance sheet. But Lennon's idealism crashed spectacularly against business reality. Within months of Apple's founding, the company became a magnet for every con artist, dreamer, and hanger-on in London. The Beatles' open-door policy attracted a parade of characters who viewed the company's coffers as their personal piggy bank. Equipment disappeared, unauthorized expenses mounted, and bizarre projects consumed money with no return on investment. The famous Apple boutique on Baker Street became a symbol of the company's dysfunction, a psychedelic fever dream that hemorrhaged cash before closing after just 8 months. The financial bleeding was staggering. Estimates suggest Apple was losing money at a rate that would have bankrupted most companies within a year. Lennon watched in horror as employees treated the company like a commune, taking liberties with company resources that no traditional business would tolerate. Freeloaders showed up daily for free meals and drinks. Studio time was wasted on vanity projects. The four Beatles found themselves funding a lifestyle for dozens of people who contributed nothing to the company's stated mission of revolutionizing the music industry. By 1969, the dream had become a nightmare. Apple Corps, the company that was supposed to liberate artists from corporate exploitation, had become a cautionary tale about what happens when musicians try to play by different rules in an industry built on extracting maximum profit from creative work. Lennon's bitter realization was that good intentions weren't enough to change a system that had been perfected over decades to benefit everyone except the artists themselves. The music industry's response to Apple's failure was predictable, a collective shrug that seemed to say, "We told you so." This is why artists should stick to making music and leave business to the professionals. While the Beatles revolutionized music, their American record company, Capitol Records, was busy butchering their art for profit. Capitol didn't just distribute Beatles albums. They carved them up, rearranged them, and repackaged them to squeeze out maximum revenue. Albums that were carefully crafted artistic statements in Britain became fragmented cash grabs in America. Songs were removed, track orders changed, and inferior stereo mixes were rushed to market. Capitol's executives answered to shareholders, not to fans, and certainly not to the artists whose work they were mangling. Lennon watched helplessly as corporate machinery ground up their creativity and spat out products. "They treat us like we're making widgets," he would later complain. This wasn't about music. It was about manufacturing units to sell to consumers. The Capitol experience taught Lennon a harsh lesson about how the industry really worked. Record companies weren't partners in the creative process. They were middlemen who saw artistic vision as an obstacle to profit maximization. In March 1966, during a routine interview with British journalist Maureen Cleave, John Lennon made an observation that would expose the music industry's true priorities. Speaking about the changing cultural landscape, he remarked that the Beatles had become more popular than Jesus among young people. He wasn't boasting. He was commenting on what he saw as the obvious reality of secularization in modern society. The comment sat dormant for months until American teen magazine Datebook republished his words in July 1966, stripped of context and presented as an inflammatory headline. Suddenly, Lennon's sociological observation became a corporate nightmare. The American Bible Belt exploded in manufactured outrage, with radio stations banning Beatles music and religious leaders organizing record burnings for television cameras. The industry's response revealed everything about where artists stood in the corporate hierarchy. Capitol Records, Beatles management, and everyone with financial stakes in the Beatles brand went into damage control mode, not to defend artistic expression, but to protect their investment. They didn't care whether Lennon's observation was accurate. They cared only that controversy threatened profits. Radio programmers who had profited enormously from Beatlemania suddenly discovered moral objections to the band's music. The same stations now competed to demonstrate righteous indignation. organizing publicity stunts disguised as moral stands. Record burnings became theater, revealing how easily the media could weaponize an artist's words for ratings and attention. Under immense pressure, Lennon was forced to apologize at a press conference in Chicago, walking back his words so the money could keep flowing. The experience left him deeply cynical about industry cowardice. He'd learned that speaking truth made him a liability to the very industry that profited from his creativity. The Jesus controversy taught him that authentic expression would always be sacrificed when it conflicted with commercial interests. By the late 1960s, Lennon's illusions about the music industry had completely shattered. The Apple Corps disaster, Capitol's butchery of their albums, and the Jesus controversy had taught him that the industry operated on principles fundamentally opposed to artistic integrity. He began speaking out against a system that treated musicians as interchangeable products, fighting for creative control and fair compensation while watching the industry resist every attempt at reform. His battles weren't just personal grievances, they were part of a broader awakening to how the entire system was rigged against the people who actually created the music. The publishing rights battle became emblematic of everything wrong with the industry. Lennon watched as songs he'd written from his soul became financial instruments, traded by businessmen who couldn't carry a tune. Northern Songs, the company that owned most of the Beatles' publishing, was sold without the band's input, turning their creative output into someone else's retirement fund. The men making millions from Lennon's lyrics had never spent a sleepless night crafting a melody, or struggled to find the perfect word to express an emotion. They were financial parasites feeding off artistic creativity. Record labels maintained iron-fisted control over every aspect of an artist's career, from which songs could be released to how they could be marketed. Lennon pushed back against this system, demanding that artists own their work, control their image, and have meaningful say in how their music was presented to the world. The industry's response was predictable: resistance at every turn. Why share power with the talent when the current system was so profitable for everyone except the artists themselves? The promotional machine particularly disgusted Lennon. He was expected to smile for cameras, give sanitized interviews, and pretend that artistic expression was secondary to commercial success. Radio stations wanted hits, not honesty. Television shows wanted entertainment, not authenticity. The entire apparatus seemed designed to transform genuine artists into manufactured personalities, processing human creativity through focus groups and market research until nothing real remained. Lennon's growing cynicism wasn't just about money. It was about the fundamental relationship between art and commerce. He'd entered the music business believing that good music would naturally find its audience, that creativity would be rewarded, that artists and industry could work together toward common goals. Instead, he discovered an ecosystem where artistic vision was systematically subordinated to quarterly profit reports, where every creative decision was filtered through marketing departments, and where speaking honestly about this reality made you a troublemaker to be managed rather than an artist to be supported. When the Beatles ended in 1970, Lennon faced the music industry as a solo artist, armed with hard-won knowledge about how the machine really worked. He'd learned to read contracts, to question executives, to fight for artistic independence. "I've learned that the music industry will try to own you if you let them," he reflected. His post-Beatles career became a masterclass in artist autonomy, making the music he wanted to make, speaking truth without corporate filters, refusing to be packaged and sold like a commodity. But independence came with a price. Radio stations were less likely to play controversial material. Record companies were less willing to promote artists who couldn't be controlled. Speaking truth to power meant accepting that the power structure would try to silence you. Lennon paid that price willingly, understanding that artistic integrity was worth more than industry approval. He'd rather make honest music for a smaller audience than manufactured pop for the masses. John Lennon died in 1980, but his battles against music industry exploitation paved the way for generations of artists who refused to be treated as corporate property. His willingness to bite the hand that fed him, to call out the Klein disaster, to expose capital's butchery, to speak uncomfortable truths about society, showed other musicians that they didn't have to accept industry abuse silently. Today's artists who demand creative control, who fight for fair streaming royalties, who speak out on social issues, are walking a path that Lennon helped clear. He proved that musicians could be more than entertainers. They could be truth-tellers, even when the industry preferred them silent. His greatest legacy isn't just the songs he wrote or the boundaries he broke musically. It's the example he set for artists who refuse to be products, who insist on being human beings with something real to say about the world they live in. In an industry built on exploitation and illusion, John Lennon chose truth. And that choice reverberates through every artist who dares to follow his lead, speaking honestly even when honesty threatens the bottom line. The music industry may have preferred him silent, but John Lennon understood something the executives never could. Real artists don't make music to serve the machine. They make music to serve the truth.